You find yourself standing in the cold, damp darkness of a Scandinavian winter evening, somewhere around the year 900 CE, in a small village nestled between fjords and forests. The air smells of peat smoke and salted fish, and you can hear the distant sound of waves crashing against rocky shores. Inside a longhouse, you settle near the central hearth, where the fire crackles with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. The flames cast long, flickering shadows on the wooden walls, which are blackened from years of smoke. Around you, several families share this space, their sleeping areas divided by simple cloth partitions. An elderly man, his face weathered by decades of harsh winters and sea spray, begins to speak in a low, measured voice. He's telling the old stories, the ones passed down through generations, stories that explain how the world came to be and why things are the way they are. The Norse people, the Vikings and their ancestors, lived in a world that was simultaneously beautiful and brutal. They inhabited the lands we now call Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, places where summer nights never fully darkened and winter days barely saw the sun. Their survival depended on fishing, farming the thin soil, raising livestock, and sometimes raiding distant shores for resources they couldn't produce themselves. In this environment, where nature's power was immediate and undeniable, they developed a complex system of beliefs to make sense of their existence. These weren't written in books initially, because most people couldn't read or write. Instead, they lived in memory, in the spoken word, in the poems and songs that skalds, the Norse poets, would recite at feasts and gatherings. The mythology wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into every aspect of existence, from the moment you woke to the moment you slept. The cosmology of the Norse universe was intricate and layered, built on the concept of multiple realms connected by a massive ancient tree. This wasn't abstract philosophy debated in halls of learning. It was the framework through which a farmer understood why his crops failed, why storms destroyed ships, why some warriors fell in battle while others survived. When you lived in the 9th or 10th century in Scandinavia, you understood that the world was far larger and stranger than what you could see with your eyes. You knew there were forces beyond your control, beings more powerful than any human, and that your place in this cosmos was small but not insignificant. The gods themselves, according to these stories, were not eternal or invincible. They had been born, they could be wounded, and one day they would die. This was a mythology that embraced the reality of endings, of cycles, of the inevitable twilight that comes to all things. The physical world you inhabited was harsh but manageable if you respected its rules. You woke before dawn most days because there was always work to be done. In winter, you might spend hours each day just keeping the fire alive, feeding it carefully rationed wood or dried peat. The smoke filled the longhouse, stinging your eyes, coating everything with a thin layer of soot. You ate simple meals, often just porridge made from barley or oats, sometimes with a bit of dried fish or preserved meat mixed in. On special occasions, there might be fresh meat, bread made with whatever grain could be grown in the short summer, and mead, that honey-based drink that took months to ferment properly. The taste of mead was sweet but strong, and drinking it during a feast while listening to the old stories made those tales feel more real, more immediate. The stories themselves began, as most creation myths do, with emptiness. Before there were gods or humans, before there was earth or sky, there was Ginnungagap, the yawning void. This wasn't just empty space, it was a gulf of potential, a place where nothing existed yet, but everything could exist. To the north of this void lay Niflheim, a realm of ice, mist, and freezing darkness. You can almost feel it if you step outside on a midwinter night in Scandinavia, that penetrating cold that seems to reach into your bones, that makes every breath visible as fog, To the south lay Muspelheim, a realm of fire, heat, and burning light, guarded by a being named Surtur, who wielded a flaming sword. These two primordial forces, ice and fire, eventually met in the void, and from their meeting creation began. The ice from Niflheim melted in the heat from Muspelheim, and from the dripping water, life emerged. The first being to form from this melting ice was Ymir, a giant of enormous size and power. Ymir wasn't good or evil in any moral sense that you might recognize. He simply was, a force of nature given form. As Ymir slept, he sweated, and from his sweat came more giants, beings of chaos and raw power. From under his arms grew a male and female, and his legs mated with each other to produce a six-headed son. These were the first of the Jötnar, the giants, beings who would forever be in tension with the gods. Alongside Ymir, the melting ice also revealed a cow named Audumbla. This primordial cow licked the salty ice blocks, and from her licking another being emerged over 3 days. First his hair appeared, then his head, and finally his whole body. This was Buri, the first of the gods' ancestors. Buri had a son named Bor, and Bor married a giantess named Bestla, and together they had 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Ve. These 3 brothers looked at the world shaped by giants and decided it needed to change. They killed Ymir, and from his massive body, they created the world as you know it. His flesh became the earth, solid ground where crops could grow and animals could graze. His blood became the seas and lakes, vast and deep and teeming with fish. His bones became mountains, the sharp peaks you can see in the distance when you stand on the coast. His teeth and broken bones became stones and boulders scattered across the land. His skull became the sky, held up at 4 points by 4 dwarves named Nordri, Sudri, Ostri, and Vestri, whose names simply mean north, south, east, and west. From Ymir's brains, thrown into the air, the brothers created clouds. His eyebrows became a barrier, a wall to protect the realm of humans, which they called Midgard, the middle enclosure, from the chaos of the giants' realm, Jotunheim. When you lived in this time, you understood that the world itself was made from the body of a slain giant, that every rock and river had once been part of a living being. It made the landscape feel alive, almost aware. The brothers took sparks and embers from Muspelheim and placed them in the sky to create the sun, moon, and stars. The sun was placed in a chariot driven by a goddess named Sol, and the moon in another chariot driven by her brother Mani. Both chariots were constantly pursued by wolves, Skoll and Hati, and this explained why the sun and moon moved across the sky each day, and why occasionally eclipses occurred when the wolves nearly caught their prey. You could see this story playing out every single day when you looked up. The sunrise wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was Sol beginning her daily race across the heavens, always fleeing, never able to rest. And one day, according to the prophecies, those wolves would finally catch their prey, and that would be one of the signs that the end times Ragnarok had begun. But that is a story for much later, for a different part of this long, slow journey through the Norse understanding of existence. You sit closer to the fire now, feeling its warmth against your face, while the cold night air seeps through the gaps in the longhouse walls behind you. The old storyteller pauses to take a slow sip of mead from a drinking horn, the liquid catching the firelight as it moves. He wipes his beard with the back of his hand and continues, his voice maintaining that same steady, unhurried cadence that makes the hours slip away unnoticed. He speaks now of the 9 realms, the 9 worlds that existed within this vast cosmos, all connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree. This wasn't a tree you could walk up to and touch, though some claimed that certain ancient ash trees in sacred groves were reflections of it, shadows of its presence. Yggdrasil existed on a scale beyond human comprehension, its roots and branches extending through all of reality, holding everything together like the frame of a great loom holds the threads of a tapestry. The 9 realms weren't stacked neatly like floors in a building, though people sometimes described them that way for simplicity. They were interconnected, overlapping, existing in relation to each other in ways that weren't entirely physical. At the center, or perhaps the middle depending on how you conceived of it, was Midgard, the realm of humans, your realm. This was the world you could see and touch and smell, the world of farmsteads and fishing boats, of forests filled with wolves and bears, of rivers that froze solid in winter and rushed wild with snowmelt in spring. Midgard was encircled by a great ocean, and in that ocean lived Jörmungandr, the world serpent, a creature so massive that it wrapped entirely around the world and held its own tail in its mouth. Fishermen sometimes claimed they'd seen its coils breaking the surface far out at sea, though whether these were true sightings or just the imaginings of men who'd been too long away from land, no one could say for certain. Above Midgard, or perhaps it was better to say in a realm that connected to Midgard through sacred places and the minds of those who sought it, was Asgard, the realm of the Aesir, the principal gods. Asgard was where Odin had his great hall Valhalla, where warriors who died bravely in battle were brought by the Valkyries to feast and fight until the end times came. The walls of Asgard were strong, built by a giant under circumstances that involved trickery and magic, a story that revealed much about how the gods operated. They were powerful, yes, but they were not above deceit when it served their purposes. Isgard was connected to Midgard by Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, a shimmering path that you might glimpse sometimes in the sky after a storm, when the sun broke through the clouds and painted colors across the heavens. Only gods and those they invited could cross Bifrost, and it was guarded by Heimdall, a god whose senses were so acute he could hear grass growing and see for hundreds of miles in any direction. Vanaheim was the realm of the Vanir, another tribe of gods who were associated more closely with fertility, prosperity, and the natural cycles of growth and harvest. The Vanir and the Aesir had once been at war, a conflict that ended not in the destruction of one side, but in a truce and an exchange of hostages. This exchange brought Njord and his children Freyr and Freyja to live among the Aesir, and it sent Aesir gods to live among the Vanir. This arrangement spoke to something the Norse understood deeply, that even among the divine, conflict was inevitable, but so was the need for cooperation and integration. When you planted your fields in spring, you might pray to Freyr for a good harvest. When you hoped for favorable winds for your ship, you might make offerings to Njord, who ruled over the sea and its bounty. These weren't distant, abstract deities. They were beings you had relationships with, beings whose favor you sought through sacrifice and proper conduct. Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, was a place of wild, untamed nature, of mountains that scraped the sky and storms that could destroy entire villages. The giants, the Jötnar, weren't simply enemies of the gods, though they often were in opposition. They were older, in many cases, than the gods themselves, representing the raw forces of the world before order was imposed upon it. Some giants were wise, possessing knowledge that even Odin sought out. Others were brutal and destructive, embodying the dangers that lurked beyond the safety of human settlements. The gods frequently interacted with the giants, sometimes in combat, sometimes in more complicated relationships. Thor, the thunder god and protector of Midgard, spent much of his time traveling to Jotunheim to battle giants who threatened the order of the world. Yet his own mother was a giantess, and many gods took giant wives or had complex dealings with them. This ambiguity, this recognition that the line between order and chaos wasn't always clear, was part of what made these stories feel true to people who lived with constant uncertainty. Beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, deep in the cold darkness, lay Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist that had existed before creation, and within or alongside it was Helheim, the realm of the dead. This wasn't a place of punishment in the way that some other cultures conceived of the afterlife. If you died of sickness or old age, if you simply lived your life and then passed away in your bed surrounded by family, you went to hell, the realm ruled by a being of the same name, who was half living flesh and half corpse. Hell was not a place of torment exactly, but it was cold and dim and joyless, a shadowy reflection of life. Warriors who died in battle went to Valhalla or to Freya's hall, Folkvanger, where the afterlife was one of feasting and fighting and celebration. This distinction mattered enormously. It meant that how you died shaped your eternal fate. That courage in the face of death had cosmic significance. An old farmer dying in his sleep might have lived a good life, but he wouldn't share the same afterlife as a warrior who fell defending his village from raiders. Alfheim was the realm of the light elves, beings of beauty and light, who were associated with the Vanir god Freyr. These weren't the tiny, mischievous fairies of later folklore. They were powerful, radiant beings, though the sources tell us less about them than about many other aspects of the cosmos. Dark elves or dwarves, depending on how you interpreted the often overlapping terms in the old texts, dwelt in Svartalfheim, a realm beneath the earth. The dwarves were master craftsmen, capable of creating objects of incredible power and artistry. They forged Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, Odin's spear, Gungnir, and Freyr's ship, Skidbladnir, which could be folded up and carried in a pocket when not in use. When you wore a piece of fine jewelry or wielded a particularly well-made tool, you might think of the dwarves and their legendary skill. They worked in darkness, deep in mountains and under hills, and they were generally best left alone unless you needed something crafted and were willing to pay their price, which was often steep and sometimes unexpected. Muspelheim, the fire realm, remained distant and dangerous, home to fire giants and ruled by Surtur, who waited with his flaming sword for the day when he would march forth to burn the world. And there was Vanaheim, already mentioned, home of the Vanir gods, though the sources sometimes left its exact nature and location somewhat vague, as if it were understood implicitly by those who originally told these tales. All of these realms were connected by Yggdrasil's branches and roots, and along those branches and roots various beings travelled. A squirrel named Ratatoska ran up and down the trunk, carrying insults between the eagle that sat in the highest branches and the dragon Nidugga that gnawed at the lowest roots. 4 stags ran along the branches, eating the foliage. At the base of the tree were 3 wells of immense significance. Urdabrunna, the well of fate, where the Norns dwelt and watered the tree; Mimisbrunna, the well of wisdom, guarded by the wise being Mimir; and Vergelmir, the roaring cauldron, source of many rivers and home to Nidugga. You listen to all of this, and the fire has burned lower now, just glowing embers that pulse with warmth but give little light. The darkness of the longhouse deepens, and outside you can hear the wind picking up, whistling through the gaps in the walls with a low, mournful sound. Someone adds more wood to the fire, and for a moment the flames leap up again, casting new shadows. The storyteller shifts his position, settling himself more comfortably, and you realize that this is just the beginning, that there is so much more to tell about the gods themselves, about their personalities and deeds, about the strange and often troubling stories that revealed what the Norse believed about power and fate, and the nature of existence itself. You feel the weight of sleep beginning to settle over you, but the storyteller's voice keeps you anchored in the present, in this smoky longhouse with its smell of unwashed wool and old timber. He speaks now of the gods themselves, starting as he must with Odin, the Allfather, the chief of the Aesir, and perhaps the most complex and contradictory figure in the entire Norse pantheon. Odin was not a simple sky father or a benevolent creator. He was a god of wisdom, yes, but wisdom gained through terrible sacrifice. He was a god of war, but not in the straightforward way that Thor embodied martial prowess. Odin was the god of kings and poets, of sorcery and the gallows, of ecstasy and of the dead. When you tried to understand Odin, you had to accept that he contained multitudes, that he was driven by an insatiable hunger for knowledge, particularly knowledge of fate and the future, even though that knowledge brought him no comfort. The most famous story about Odin's quest for wisdom involved his eye. According to the tale, Odin came to Mimisbrunna, the well of wisdom, which lay beneath one of Yggdrasil's roots. The well was guarded by Mimir, a being of immense knowledge, and its waters contained wisdom beyond measure. Odin desired to drink from this well, to gain the understanding it offered, but Mimir demanded a price. Not gold, not favors, but sacrifice. Odin plucked out one of his own eyes and gave it to Mimir, and only then was he allowed to drink. From that moment forward, Odin was one-eyed, marked by his sacrifice, and he gained knowledge that burdened him as much as it empowered him. When you saw a one-eyed wanderer on the road, wearing a broad-brimmed hat and carrying a staff, you might wonder if it was Odin himself, traveling in disguise as he often did, testing the hospitality of humans or seeking more knowledge in the mortal realm. Odin's quest for wisdom didn't end there. He also hanged himself from Yggdrasil, pierced himself with his own spear, and hung there for 9 nights without food or water, a sacrifice of himself to himself, until the secrets of the runes were revealed to him. The runes weren't just an alphabet for writing, they were symbols of power, each one containing magical significance, each one a key to understanding deeper truths about reality. When Avelva, a seeress, carved runes and spoke prophecies, she was tapping into the same power that Odin had gained through his ordeal. When warriors carved runes on their weapons or on stones to commemorate the dead, they were invoking forces that connected directly to the divine. You might not be able to read or write yourself, but you understood that those symbols had power, that they weren't mere marks, but living things in their own way. Odin had many names, and this itself told you something about him. He was called Grimnir, the Masked One. He was Gangleri, the Wanderer. He was Bölverkr, the Evildoer. He was Har, the High One. He had dozens of names, perhaps more than 100, each one revealing a different aspect of his nature or commemorating a different deed or disguise. In his hall, Valhalla, he gathered warriors who had died in battle. The Einherjar, who feasted each night and fought each day in preparation for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world. Odin didn't gather these warriors out of sentimentality or to reward their bravery in any simple sense. He needed them. He knew that when Ragnarok came, when the forces of chaos and destruction marched against the gods, he would need every warrior he could muster, and even then it wouldn't be enough. This knowledge, this certainty of eventual defeat, hung over everything Odin did. He was a god preparing for a war he knew he would lose. Thor, Odin's son, was in many ways easier to understand, more straightforward in his nature and his purpose. Thor was the thunder god, the protector of both gods and humans, the wielder of Mjolnir, the hammer that always returned to his hand after he threw it, and that could level mountains when he struck with full force. Thor was immensely strong, possessed of a legendary appetite for food and drink, and quick to anger when dealing with giants or other threats. He had red hair and a red beard, and he travelled in a chariot pulled by 2 goats, Tungrisnir and Tungjoster, whose names meant something like teeth-bearer and teeth-grinder. These goats were remarkable because Thor could slaughter them, cook them, and eat them in the evening and then in the morning. If he blessed their bones with his hammer, they would come back to life, ready to pull his chariot again. The common people loved Thor in a way they didn't quite love Odin. Odin was distant, mysterious, dangerous even. Thor was accessible. When lightning flashed across the sky and thunder rolled over the hills, that was Thor riding his chariot across the heavens, heading to Jotunheim to battle giants who threatened the cosmic order. When you were a farmer worried about your crops, you might pray to Freya, but when raiders came or when the forces of chaos seemed too close, you thought of Thor. He represented the defender, the one who stood between civilization and destruction, who used his strength not for conquest, but for protection. His hammer, worn as an amulet around the neck, became one of the most common religious symbols of the Norse world, a sign of faith and a ward against evil. Thor's relationship with the giants was complicated, much like the gods' relationship with them in general. His mother was Jord, often identified as a giantess, the personification of Earth itself. He frequently traveled to Jotunheim, and the stories of these journeys revealed both his strength and occasionally his limitations. In one tale, Thor and Loki traveled to the hall of a giant king named Utgarda-Loki, whose name meant something like Loki of the outer place. There, Thor was subjected to a series of challenges that seemed simple, but which he failed at in humiliating ways. He couldn't drink a horn empty, though he tried 3 times. He couldn't lift a cat off the ground. He was nearly defeated in a wrestling match by an old woman. Only later did Utgarda-Loki reveal that these were illusions, tricks of magic. The horn had been connected to the ocean, and Thor had drunk so much that he'd lowered the sea level. The cat had been Jörmungandr, the world serpent in disguise, and Thor had nearly lifted it entirely from the ocean floor, which would have been catastrophic. The old woman had been old age itself, which no one, not even a god, could defeat. This story suggested that even Thor, for all his might, couldn't overcome everything through strength alone. Loki was perhaps the most difficult of all the gods to categorize or understand. He wasn't truly one of the Aesir by birth. He was the son of giants, specifically of the giant Farbauti and a being named Laufey, or Null. Yet Odin had made a blood oath with Loki, binding them as brothers, and so Loki dwelt in Asgard among the gods. Loki was clever, a shapeshifter, a trickster whose schemes sometimes helped the gods and sometimes caused them immense trouble. He had given birth, in the form of a mare, to Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse, after he transformed himself to lure away the horse of a giant who was building Asgard's walls. His other children included Hel, the ruler of the realm of the dead, Jörmungandr, the world serpent, and Fenrir, the monstrous wolf that the gods feared so much they bound him with magical chains. These children, born of Loki and the giantess Angrboda, were themselves harbingers of destruction, destined to play crucial roles in Ragnarok. Loki's relationship with the other gods was one of constant tension. He accompanied Thor on his journeys, and his quick thinking often got them out of trouble, though his actions had usually caused the trouble in the first place. He once cut off the hair of Sif, Thor's wife, as a prank, and only escaped Thor's wrath by promising to have the dwarves forge new hair for her, hair made of real gold that would grow like natural hair. In the process of fulfilling this promise, Loki wagered his own head with the dwarves and ended up getting some of the gods' most treasured possessions made, including Thor's hammer and Odin's spear. But Loki's tricks grew darker over time. He arranged the death of Balder, the most beloved of the gods, through an act of calculated cruelty that involved deception, manipulation, and the exploitation of a blind god's trust. For this crime, the gods finally punished him, binding him beneath the earth where a serpent dripped venom onto his face, and there he would remain until Ragnarok, when he would break free and lead the forces of chaos against the gods who had been his companions. You shift your position on the bench, stretching your legs toward the fire. The hall is quieter now. Some of the children have fallen asleep, curled up in their parents' laps or on piles of furs in the corners. A dog that had been lying near the fire gets up, turns in a circle 3 times, and settles back down with a sigh. Outside, you can hear the wind continuing its work, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of the sea remains constant, rhythmic, eternal. The storyteller takes another small sip of mead, and you notice his eyes have that faraway look of someone who is not entirely present, who is seeing the stories as he tells them, walking through Asgard's halls and across Bifrost in his mind's eye, even as his body remains here in this smoky, warm, crowded space. You pull your cloak tighter round your shoulders as a draught finds its way through the longhouse walls, carrying with it the smell of the sea and the faint scent of snow that hasn't yet fallen, but surely will before morning. The storyteller continues, his voice never rising, never falling into silence for long, maintaining that same measured rhythm that has carried you through the evening. He speaks now of the other gods, the ones who filled Asgard's halls, and who each had their own domains, their own stories, their own significance in the great tapestry of existence. These were not distant, impersonal forces, but beings with personalities, with desires and fears, with relationships that were as complicated as those of any human family, perhaps even more so, given their power and the stakes involved in their conflicts. Frigg was Odin's wife, the queen of the Aesir, a goddess associated with marriage, motherhood, and the domestic sphere, though her power extended far beyond such simple categories. She possessed the gift of prophecy, the ability to see the future, though like Odin, she generally kept what she knew to herself. It was said that she knew all fates, but spoke none of them, a restraint that must have required tremendous discipline given what she foresaw. Frigg dwelt in her own hall called Fensalir, the Fen Halls, and from there she oversaw the affairs of the home and hearth. When a woman sat at her loom, working thread into cloth that would clothe her family through the winter, she might think of Frigg, who was said to spin clouds. When a mother worried over a sick child or hoped for her son's safe return from a voyage, Frigg was the one who understood that particular anguish, having herself lost a son to death despite all her foreknowledge and all her attempts to prevent it. That son was Balder, often called Balder the Beautiful or Balder the Good, who embodied light, purity, and joy. Balder was loved by all who knew him, gods and mortals alike, and his presence in Asgard was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. But Balder began to have dreams, troubling dreams that foretold his own death, and these dreams disturbed not just him, but all the gods, because they understood that Balder's death would be a sign, a crack in the order of things, a step toward the inevitable ending that awaited them all. Frigg, determined to protect her son, traveled throughout all the 9 realms, extracting oaths from everything in existence, every animal, every plant, every stone and metal and disease, that they would not harm Balder. She was thorough in her quest, speaking to everything she could think of, and everything agreed readily, because Balder was so beloved that nothing wanted to harm him anyway. Having secured these oaths, the gods developed a new entertainment. They would have Balder stand in the middle of the hall while they threw things at him, stones, weapons, whatever came to hand, and everything would bounce off harmlessly or swerve away at the last moment, unable to break the oaths that protected him. This became a game, a celebration of Balder's invulnerability and a source of great amusement during their gatherings. But Loki, watching this, felt something other than amusement. Perhaps it was jealousy, or perhaps it was simply his nature as an agent of chaos, finding the perfection of Balder's protection unbearable. Loki disguised himself as an old woman and went to Frigg, engaging her in conversation, and through careful questioning discovered that there was one thing from which Frigg had not extracted an oath. The mistletoe had seemed too young, too insignificant, hardly worth the trouble, and so Frigg had passed it by. Loki went immediately to find mistletoe, and he fashioned it into a dart or a spear, depending on which version of the story you heard. He brought this back to the hall, where the gods were still playing their game with Balder, and he approached Höder, Balder's blind brother, who stood apart from the others, unable to participate in the throwing because he couldn't see where to aim. Loki, with false kindness, offered to help Höder join in the fun, guiding his hand and giving him the mistletoe to throw. Höder, trusting and wanting only to honor his brother like everyone else, threw the dart, and it struck Balder and killed him instantly. The silence that fell over the hall in that moment must have been absolute, the kind of silence that seems to stop time itself. Balder fell, and with him fell something essential, some quality of light and hope that could not be recovered. The gods were devastated. Frigg asked if anyone would volunteer to ride to Hel, to the realm of the dead, and attempt to ransom Balder back. Hermodr, another of Odin's sons, volunteered for this dangerous journey. He rode Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse, down the long, dark road to Hel's realm, a journey that took 9 nights through valleys so deep and dark that he could see nothing at all. When he arrived and was granted audience with Hel herself, she told him that Balder could return to the living world on one condition: if everything in all the worlds would weep for him. If even one thing refused to weep, Balder would have to remain in her realm. Hermodr returned with this message, and the gods sent messengers throughout all creation, asking everything to weep for Balder. And everything did. People, animals, plants, stones, metals, the earth itself wept, producing the dew that forms on all things. Everything wept, except for one giantess in a cave named Thok, who refused, saying that Balder had never done anything for her, and she would shed no tears. And so Balder remained dead, trapped in Hel's cold halls, until after Ragnarök, when a new world would emerge. Many suspected that Thok had been Loki in disguise, one final act of spite to ensure his mischief couldn't be undone. The gods hunted Loki after this, and when they found him, they bound him in a cave with the entrails of his own son, which had been turned to iron. Above his face they placed a serpent that dripped burning venom. Loki's wife Sigyn remained with him, holding a bowl to catch the venom, but when the bowl filled and she had to turn away to empty it, the venom dripped onto Loki's face, causing him to writhe in agony. His writhing, it was said, caused earthquakes in the mortal world, and there he remained, bound and tormented, until the day when he would break free at Ragnarök and have his revenge against the gods who had punished him. Freyr and Freya, the twin children of Njord, were among the Vanir who came to live with the Aesir as part of the peace settlement between the two tribes of gods. Freyr was a god of fertility, prosperity, and fair weather, associated with virility and peace, with the kind of abundance that made life worth living. He possessed a ship called Skidbladnir that always had favorable wind and could be folded up small enough to carry in a pocket. And he owned a boar named Gullinbursti, whose golden bristles shone in the dark, and who could run through air and sea faster than any horse. Freyr also once possessed a sword that fought by itself, but he gave this away to win the love of a giantess named Gerda, a decision that would cost him dearly at Ragnarök when he faced Surtur without his weapon. This story of Freyr trading his most powerful possession for love revealed something about the Norse understanding of desire and choice, how even gods made decisions that they knew would have terrible consequences because the heart demanded what it demanded. Freya was a goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and also of war and death. She was said to be the most beautiful of all the goddesses, and she wore a magnificent necklace called Brisingamen that she had obtained from 4 dwarves at a price the stories only hinted at darkly. Freya had the first choice of the slain warriors, taking half of them to her hall Folkvanga before Odin's Valkyries could claim them for Valhalla. She travelled in a chariot pulled by cats, which anyone who has tried to get cats to cooperate with anything would recognize as a sign of her considerable power. She practiced Seder, a form of magic associated with women and with the Vanir, magic that involved divination and the manipulation of fate itself. When an Aesir god practiced Sadur, particularly a male god, it was considered somewhat shameful, or at least unusual, but Freyr taught this art to Odin, and he learned it despite the social stigma because his hunger for knowledge and power overcame any concerns about propriety. Tyr was a god of war, but more specifically of law, justice, and honorable combat. He was the bravest of the gods, and the story that best illustrated this involved the binding of Fenrir, the monstrous wolf who was one of Loki's children. The gods knew from prophecy that Fenrir would cause great destruction, and as he grew larger and more dangerous, they decided he needed to be bound. They tried twice with regular chains, but Fenrir broke them easily. Finally, the dwarves crafted a magical ribbon called Gleipnir, made from impossible things. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. This ribbon was thin and soft-looking, but it was unbreakable. Fenrir, suspicious of magic, agreed to let the gods bind him with it, only if one of them would place their hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith. Only Tyr was brave enough to do this. When Fenrir found himself bound and unable to break free, he bit down, severing Tyr's hand at the wrist. From that day forward, Tyr was one-handed, marked by his sacrifice for the safety of the gods and the world. You notice that the fire has burned down again to mostly embers, pulsing with deep orange light that barely illuminates the faces around you. Someone's breathing has deepened into sleep nearby, a gentle snoring that blends with the sound of the wind outside. The storyteller's face is half in shadow, his remaining visible eye reflecting the firelight as he continues to speak. And you realize that these stories are not entertainment in the way you might think of entertainment. They are teaching tools, ways of understanding courage and sacrifice, ways of making sense of a world where strength wasn't always enough, where cleverness could be both salvation and damnation, where even the gods themselves were subject to fate and couldn't escape the consequences of their choices. You feel the hour growing late, though in the depth of winter it's hard to judge time by anything other than the state of the fire and the heaviness in your limbs. The storyteller reaches for a piece of dried fish that sits on a wooden plate nearby, chewing it slowly and thoughtfully before he continues. His voice, when it resumes, has that same unwavering quality, like the movement of water in a stream, constant and unhurried. He turns his attention now to the beings who governed fate itself and to the nature of destiny in the Norse understanding of the world, a topic that permeated every aspect of life and belief, that made the courage of warriors and the resignation of the old equally comprehensible within the same framework. At the base of Yggdrasil, beside Urdabrunner, the Well of Fate, dwelt the Norns, three powerful female beings whose names were Urdur, Verdandi, and Skuld, which meant something like past, present, and future, though the translation was never quite perfect, because the Norse conception of time was different from the linear progression you might imagine. The Norns watered the roots of Yggdrasil every day, keeping the great tree alive, and they carved runes into its trunk, runes that determined the fate of every being in all the 9 realms. These weren't suggestions or possibilities, but certainties, fixed points that could be known but not changed. When a child was born, the Norns set their fate, determining the length and nature of their life, and nothing could alter what they had decided. This wasn't a distant, abstract force, but something immediate and personal, something that sat beside every cradle and waited at every crossroads. The concept of fate, of weird or Urlog as it was known, was central to how the Norse viewed existence. It didn't mean that individual action was meaningless or that people should simply surrender to whatever happened. Rather, it meant that there was a proper way to meet your fate, a correct bearing to maintain in the face of what was inevitable. Courage wasn't the absence of fear or the belief that you could overcome anything through strength or cleverness. Courage was knowing what was coming, knowing it might be terrible, and facing it with dignity and resolve anyway. When a warrior went into battle knowing the Norns had already determined whether he would survive, his bravery consisted not in thinking he could change that outcome, but in meeting it appropriately, in dying well if death was his fate, in living honorably if life continued for him a while longer. This understanding of fate extended to the gods themselves, and indeed the greatest demonstration of it was the prophecy of Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, the end of the world as it existed. The gods knew this ending was coming. Odin had learned of it through his many quests for knowledge, through his conversations with the Völva, the seeresses who could see the future, through his own sacrifices and his drinking from the well of wisdom. He knew that a time would come when the bonds holding Loki would break, when Fenrir would slip his chains, when the fire giant Surtur would march from Muspelheim, when the forces of chaos and destruction would gather and make war against the gods. He knew that in this battle many gods would die, including himself. He knew that Thor would slay Jörmungandr, but would himself die from the serpent's venom. He knew that Freya would fall to Surtur's flaming sword. He knew that the sun and moon would be swallowed by the wolves that had chased them since the beginning of time. He knew that fire would consume the world. And yet, knowing all of this, Odin still gathered his warriors in Valhalla. He still prepared for battle. He still did everything in his power to strengthen the gods' position, even though he knew the outcome was already determined. This was the essence of the Norse heroic ideal, the idea that you fought, not because you could win, but because fighting was what honor demanded, because meeting your fate bravely was the only thing that gave meaning to existence in a universe where everything, even gods, was temporary. When you lived as a Norse farmer or warrior in the 9th or 10th century, this worldview made sense of the hardships you faced, the brutal winters, the crop failures, the raids, the diseases that took your children despite all your prayers and sacrifices. You couldn't change these things, but you could control how you faced them. The Valkyries were Odin's messengers and agents in this cosmic drama, supernatural women who rode through the sky on horseback, who appeared on battlefields to choose which warriors would die and which would survive. Their name meant choosers of the slain, and when a warrior saw a Valkyrie, he knew his death was near. But this wasn't entirely a cause for despair, because being chosen by a Valkyrie meant you would be brought to Valhalla, that you would spend the afterlife in the company of heroes, feasting on the meat of the boar Saehrimnir, who was slaughtered and cooked each evening and came back to life each morning, drinking mead that flowed from the udders of the goat Heidrun, who ate the leaves of Yggdrasil. You would fight each day in the fields outside Valhalla, practicing for the final battle, and your wounds would heal each evening so you could feast and drink without pain. The descriptions of Valhalla made it sound like an idealized version of a warrior's life, all the glory and camaraderie without the actual permanent death or disability, at least until Ragnarök came. The hall itself was enormous, with 540 doors, each wide enough that 800 warriors could march out abreast when the time came to fight. The roof was made of shields, the rafters were spears, and mail coats were strewn about the benches. This was a place that celebrated the warrior's craft, that honored the skills and values that kept communities safe in a dangerous world. When you attended a feast in your own village's hall, when you saw the warriors sitting together and drinking and boasting about their deeds, you were seeing a pale reflection of what went on in Valhalla every single night. But not all the dead went to Valhalla, and not all the dead went to Hell's shadowy realm either. There were other destinations, other possibilities. Freyja took half the slain to Folkvangr, her own hall, and the sources suggested this was considered at least as honorable as going to Valhalla, perhaps even more so given that she had first choice. Those who died at sea might go to the goddess Ran, who lived beneath the waves and welcomed the drowned into her halls. The specifics were not always clear, and indeed there seemed to be some variation in belief from place to place and time to time, which made sense, given that these weren't doctrines written in sacred texts, but rather living traditions passed down orally and adapted to local understanding. What remained consistent was the idea that death was not an ending but a transition, and that the manner of your death mattered enormously in determining what came next. There were other beings in this cosmos who played important roles, figures who appeared in stories but whose exact nature was sometimes ambiguous. The dwarves, already mentioned as master craftsmen, were complex creatures who lived beneath mountains and were often portrayed as ugly or misshapen, but possessed of incredible skill and knowledge. They had created most of the gods' treasures and weapons, but they were also dangerous if crossed, capable of curses and deceptions. The elves, both light and dark, had their own realms and their own concerns, though they intersected with human and divine affairs at various points. There were landvetir, land spirits who inhabited specific places and who needed to be respected and honored if you wanted to live safely in their territory. When ships approached Iceland, for instance, they were supposed to remove the dragonhead prows before coming into harbour, lest they frighten the landvetir and bring misfortune. The giants, the Jotnar, remained a constant presence in the background of most stories, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as sources of wisdom, sometimes as marriage partners or parents of gods. They represented the forces of nature that existed before civilization, before order, the wild and unpredictable elements that could never be fully tamed or controlled. The relationship between gods and giants was one of eternal tension, not quite all-out war, but never quite peace either. It reflected the relationship humans had with the natural world, the sea that provided fish but could also drown you, the forest that provided wood and game but also sheltered wolves and bears, the mountains that were beautiful but treacherous. The giants were necessary parts of the cosmos, essential to its functioning even when they threatened it. You shift again on your bench, feeling the stiffness in your back from sitting so long in one position. The fire has been fed once more, and burns with a steadier flame now, though still not high, just enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. A woman across the hall is nursing an infant, rocking gently and humming a tune so quietly you can barely hear it under the storyteller's voice. The baby's small sounds of contentment blend with the crackling of the fire and the wind outside, creating a symphony of domestic peace that exists in stark contrast to the tales of cosmic warfare and inevitable doom being recounted. But perhaps that's the point, you think. Perhaps these stories of gods and giants and the end of all things make the simple moments of warmth and safety more precious, more worthy of appreciation. When you know that everything ends, even the gods themselves, the bread you eat and the child you hold become sacred in their temporality. You notice that a few more people have drifted off to sleep now, their heads resting against the shoulders of family members or tilted back against the wooden walls of the longhouse. The storyteller doesn't seem to mind, or even particularly notice. He continues in the same measured tone, speaking to those who remain awake and to the fire itself, perhaps, or to the night beyond the walls. He turns now to the stories of creation in more detail, to how humans came to be, and to the daily interactions between the divine and mortal realms, the ways in which the gods were not distant abstractions, but active participants in the world you inhabited, beings you might encounter if circumstances aligned in particular ways. According to the stories passed down through generations, the first humans were created by Odin and his brothers Vili and Ve as they walked along a beach one day. They found 2 tree trunks, or perhaps 2 pieces of driftwood, washed up on the shore. One was ash, the other elm, though some tellings varied on these details. The 3 brothers decided to give these pieces of wood life and form, to create something new in the world they had shaped from Ymir's body. Odin gave them breath and life, the vital spirit that animated all living things. Vili gave them consciousness, the ability to think and understand, to have inner lives and make decisions. Ve gave them form and the senses, the ability to see and hear and taste and touch and smell the world around them. From these gifts, the first man and woman emerged, named Aska and Embla, whose names meant ash and possibly elm or vine, connecting them forever to their origins as trees. Aska and Embla became the ancestors of all humanity, dwelling in Midgard, the realm that had been made for them, protected by the wall fashioned from Ymir's eyebrows. This origin story was different from some you might have heard from Christians or from traders who came from the south and east. Humans weren't fallen or sinful by nature, weren't being punished or tested. They were simply part of the world, made from its materials, given life by the gods who had crafted everything else. There was no original sin to atone for, no fundamental separation between the human and the divine. The gods had their realm, humans had theirs, but the boundaries were not absolute. Gods walked in the mortal world. Humans could, under certain circumstances, reach the divine. The cosmos was permeable in ways that made interaction possible, even common. The gods demanded worship and sacrifice, but the relationship was transactional rather than one of absolute submission. You gave offerings to the gods because you wanted their favor, their help with the harvest or the hunt or the voyage. You poured out libations of mead or beer. You sacrificed animals. You raised standing stones carved with runes and images. In return, you hoped for good fortune, for protection, for the continued functioning of the natural and social order. When you held a blot, a sacrificial feast, the entire community participated, sharing in the meat of the sacrificed animal, drinking together, reinforcing social bonds while simultaneously honoring the gods. The spiritual and the social were not separate spheres, but intertwined aspects of the same reality. Different gods received worship in different contexts and from different people. A king or warrior might make special offerings to Odin, seeking wisdom in counsel or victory in battle. A farmer would focus his devotions on Freyr, asking for fertile fields and healthy livestock. A sailor, leaving on a voyage, would honor Njord, seeking calm seas and favorable winds. Women might make offerings to Frigg or Freya, depending on their specific needs and situations. This wasn't monotheism, with one all-powerful deity demanding exclusive worship. It was a rich, polytheistic system where you developed relationships with multiple gods, where you might honor different deities at different times, depending on what you needed from them. The gods themselves had specialties, domains where their power was strongest, and you approached them accordingly. There were holy places throughout the landscape, locations where the boundary between the mortal and divine realms seemed thinner, more easily crossed. Certain groves of trees were considered sacred, and to cut them down or defile them would bring terrible misfortune. Springs and wells sometimes had spiritual significance, places where you might leave offerings or seek visions. Mountains and unusual rock formations could be dwelling places of spirits or gods. When you traveled through the landscape, you were constantly aware of these sacred geographies, these points where the ordinary world opened onto something greater and more dangerous. To disrespect these places was not just socially unacceptable, but genuinely perilous, because you never knew when a god or powerful spirit might be watching, might take offense at human presumption or carelessness. The practice of Seder, the magic that Freya taught to Odin, was another way of interacting with the divine and with fate itself. A völva, a woman who practiced this art, would enter a trance state, sometimes sitting on a high platform or special seat, surrounded by other women who would sing to help induce the trance. In this altered state of consciousness, the völva could see hidden things, could perceive the workings of fate, could communicate with spirits and gods, could sometimes even influence events through her magic. This was powerful and somewhat dangerous work, associated with women and with the veneer, carrying connotations that made it slightly suspect even as it was sought after. When a Völva came to your community, you treated her with respect and perhaps some wariness, because her knowledge and power set her apart from ordinary people. Dreams, too, were significant, potential messages from the gods or glimpses of fate working itself out. When Baldur dreamed of his death, this wasn't dismissed as meaningless anxiety, but recognized as a genuine prophecy, something that needed to be taken seriously and acted upon. You paid attention to your own dreams, looking for signs and warnings, for guidance from forces beyond your conscious understanding. If you dreamed of ravens, you might think of Odin, whose two ravens, Hugin and Munin, flew throughout the world each day, gathering information and whispering it in his ears. If you dreamed of a great wolf, you might worry about Fenrir, about chaos breaking loose from its bonds. Dreams were windows into the larger patterns of reality, and ignoring them could be as dangerous as ignoring the advice of a Völva or the omens you read in the flight of birds or the behavior of animals. The cycle of the year had its own sacred rhythms, times when the veil between worlds was thinner, when certain rituals needed to be performed. The winter solstice, the longest night of the year, was a time of particular significance, a moment when you hoped the sun would return, when the light would begin to grow again rather than darkness consuming everything. There would be feasts at this time, celebrations that served both to lift spirits during the darkest part of winter and to honor the gods whose blessings you needed to survive until spring. Other points in the agricultural cycle had their own observances, times for planting rites, harvest celebrations, ceremonies to mark the movement of livestock to and from summer pastures. Your life moved in rhythm with these cycles, and the gods moved with them as well, their influences waxing and waning with the seasons. You think about your own life, about the offerings you've made and the prayers you've spoken, about the times you've felt something like divine presence, a moment when the ordinary world seemed to open up and reveal something greater behind it. Maybe it was when you were alone in the forest and heard sounds you couldn't explain, or when you were at sea and the sky and water seemed to merge into something vast and alive. Maybe it was in dreams, or in the moment before sleep when your mind drifted and images came unbidden. The gods were not abstractions in a book. They were forces you felt, presences you sensed, beings who inhabited the same cosmos you did, just in different ways, with different powers. When you poured mead on the ground as an offering, some part of you believed it went somewhere, that it was received and acknowledged, that the reciprocal relationship between humans and gods was real and binding. The storyteller pauses to clear his throat, and someone hands him a cup of water, which he drinks slowly before setting it aside. The fire has settled into a pattern now, burning steadily without needing constant attention, its heat radiating out in waves that reach your face and hands while your back remains cool where it faces the wall. You can smell the smoke more strongly now, that particular scent of burning wood, mixed with the organic smells of the longhouse, the wool and leather and unwashed bodies, the dried fish and stored grain, the earthen floor packed hard from years of use. It's not an unpleasant smell, just familiar, the smell of home and safety, of walls that keep the winter night at bay, and a roof that sheds the rain. Outside this space, the world is vast and dark and full of forces that could kill you without effort. Inside, there is warmth and story and community, the things that make life bearable, even good. You find yourself growing drowsy now, your eyelids heavy. But some part of you wants to hear the rest, wants to know how the story ends, even though you've heard it before, even though everyone knows how it ends, because the ending was determined before the beginning, written into the fabric of reality by the Norns themselves. The storyteller seems to sense this moment in his audience, this tipping point between waking and sleeping, and his voice takes on an even more measured quality, slower somehow without actually changing pace, like the last movement of a long piece of music that guides you gently toward its conclusion. He speaks now of Ragnarök, the doom of the gods, the final battle, the end of everything, and what, if anything, might come after. The signs of Ragnarök were specific and terrible, a cascade of catastrophes that would make it clear that the end had finally come. First would come the Fimbulwinter, 3 successive winters with no summers in between, a cold so deep and lasting that it would destroy crops, kill livestock, and drive people to desperation. During this time, all social bonds would break down. Brothers would kill brothers, fathers would turn against sons, families would tear themselves apart in struggles for survival. The moral order that held society together would collapse entirely, and this breakdown of human civilization would be a mirror and a precursor to the cosmic dissolution that followed. You can imagine this easily enough, having lived through hard winters, having seen what hunger and cold can do to people's judgment. How quickly desperation can override honor when children are starving and death seems certain. After the Fimbulwinter would come the breaking of bonds, the release of all the forces that the gods had worked to contain. Fenrir the great wolf would break free from Gleipnir, the magical ribbon that had held him since Tyr sacrificed his hand. The wolf had grown enormous over the ages, fed on the flesh of criminals and oath-breakers, and when he finally broke loose, his lower jaw would drag on the ground while his upper jaw scraped the sky, and flames would pour from his eyes and nostrils. Jörmungandr, the world serpent, would rise from the ocean depths, thrashing and writhing, causing massive waves that would flood the lands. The serpent's movement would poison the very sky, filling the air with venom. Loki would break free from his bonds beneath the earth, no longer held by the transformed entrails of his son, no longer tormented by dripping venom, and he would gather the forces of chaos to march against the gods. From Muspelheim, Surtur would lead the fire giants, crossing Bifrost with such weight and heat that the rainbow bridge would shatter beneath them. The sky would split open, and Surtur's flaming sword would shine brighter than the sun itself, a sun that would by then have been swallowed by the wolf skull, just as the moon would have been devoured by Hati. The stars would fall from the sky, plunging the world into darkness, broken only by the fires of destruction. Naglfar, a ship made entirely from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, would sail from Hell's realm, crewed by the dishonored dead and steered by Loki himself. This detail about the ship always made people careful to trim the nails of their dead before burial, because every untrimmed nail contributed to building this terrible vessel, hastening the day of doom. The forces of chaos and destruction would gather on the plain of Vigrid, a vast battlefield that stretched 100 leagues in every direction. The gods would see them coming, and Heimdall, the watchman of the gods who stood guard at the broken remnants of Bifrost, would sound the Gjallarhorn, a horn whose blast could be heard throughout all the 9 realms. This would be the signal, the call to the final battle. Odin would lead the Aesir out of Asgard, and with them would march the Einherjar, all the warriors who had been gathered in Valhalla for precisely this moment. They would pour out of the hall's 540 doors, 800 warriors through each door, a vast army of the honored dead coming to fight one last time alongside the gods they had worshipped in life. The battle itself would be catastrophic, a series of individual combats between mighty opponents, each one a story of heroism and inevitable tragedy. Odin would face Fenrir, and the great wolf would swallow him whole, killing the Allfather, the chief of the gods, the one who had sacrificed so much to gain the wisdom that told him this moment would come. But Odin's son Vidar would immediately avenge his father, placing one foot on Fenrir's lower jaw. He wore a special shoe made from all the leather scraps that had ever been discarded, another detail that encouraged people not to waste anything, and grasping the upper jaw with his hands, tearing the wolf's mouth apart and killing the beast. Thor would fight Jörmungandr, the world serpent he had nearly lifted in the hall of Utgarda Loki, the enemy he had faced in various forms throughout the ages. Thor would finally kill the serpent with a blow from Mjolnir, but the victory would cost him everything. He would take 9 steps backward after striking the fatal blow, and then he would fall dead, poisoned by the venom that Jörmungandr spewed in its death throes. Freya would face Surtur, but without his sword, the weapon he had traded away for love, he would be at a terrible disadvantage. The fire giant would strike him down, and after killing Freya, Surtur would fling fire in every direction, setting the 9 realms ablaze. The world tree Yggdrasil would burn, though it had endured through all of time. Asgard would burn, Midgard would burn, the sea would boil, and the earth itself would sink beneath the waves. Everything that had been carefully ordered and maintained since the creation, everything that Odin and his brothers had made from Ymir's body, would be undone, returned to chaos and flame and drowning darkness. Loki and Heimdall would kill each other in single combat, ending both their long enmity and their strange connection. Tyr and Garma, the hound that guarded Hel's gates, would slay one another. Almost all the gods would die, and almost all the worlds would be destroyed. But the prophecy didn't end with pure destruction. According to the Völva who spoke to Odin, who saw the future in her visions after the fire and the flood, after everything had been consumed and destroyed, the earth would rise again from the sea. It would be green and beautiful, fertile without being cultivated, and water would flow in streams where no one had dug channels. Some of the gods would survive, Vidar and Vali, Odin's sons, and Modi and Magni, Thor's sons, who would inherit their father's hammer. Balder would return from Hel, emerging into this new world along with his blind brother Hörder, their old tragedy somehow resolved or transcended in the rebirth. These surviving gods would gather at Idavölla, where Asgard had once stood, and they would find among the grass the golden chess pieces that the Aesir had played with in the old days, before Ragnarök, a connection to what had been lost. 2 humans would also survive, a man and a woman named Lif and Liftrasir, whose names meant life and life yearning, or eager for life. They would have hidden themselves in the wood of Yggdrasil, protected somehow from the flames and the flood, and from them would descend a new human race. They would eat the morning dew, and the world would be populated again. A new sun would appear in the sky, the daughter of the old sun that had been devoured, continuing her mother's journey across the heavens. The earth would bear fruit without being sown, and suffering would disappear, at least for a time. This new world would be better than the old, or at least different, a fresh start after the complete destruction of everything that had come before. This vision of cyclical time, of endings that were also beginnings, of destruction as a necessary precursor to renewal, shaped how the Norse understood their own lives and deaths. Nothing was permanent, not even the gods, not even the world itself. But this impermanence didn't make things meaningless. If anything, it made them more meaningful, more precious, because they were temporary. The gods knew they would die, but fought anyway. Humans knew they would die, but lived with honor anyway. The world itself would end, but that didn't stop anyone from planting crops in spring, or defending their homes from raiders, or raising children who would carry on after you were gone. You did what was right, what was honorable, what was necessary, not because it would change the ultimate outcome, but because it was who you were, because your reputation, your honor, was the only thing that would outlive you, the only thing that mattered in the end. The stories also suggested that there might be other beings, other powers beyond even the cycle of Ragnarök and rebirth. There were hints in the prophecies of a mighty one who would come, though who or what this being was remained deliberately vague, never fully explained. Some Christian missionaries later tried to claim this referred to their God, but the Norse understanding was more ambiguous, more open to mystery. Not everything could be known or explained. The cosmos was vast, and contained layers of meaning that even the most knowledgeable Völva or the wisest god couldn't fully comprehend. This acceptance of mystery, of the limits of knowledge, even divine knowledge, was part of the worldview. You did your best to understand, but you also recognized that some things would always remain hidden, that the universe was larger and stranger than any story could capture. You realize that your eyes have been closed for a while now, that you've been listening in that state between waking and sleeping, where the storyteller's words paint pictures in your mind more vivid than anything you see with your eyes open. The fire's warmth has made you comfortable despite the cold night outside, and the voice continues, steady and calm, guiding you through these ancient narratives of gods and giants, of creation and destruction, of the great wheel of time that turns and turns and will turn again. Somewhere outside, an animal makes a sound, maybe a fox or a cat, and then falls silent. The wind has died down somewhat, or perhaps you've just stopped noticing it. Inside the longhouse, everything feels suspended, timeless, as if you've stepped outside the normal flow of hours and into the eternal present where these stories always exist, always true, always unfolding. You are almost completely asleep now, balanced on that knife's edge where consciousness fades but hasn't entirely departed, where the storyteller's voice seems to come from very far away and yet remains perfectly clear, each word distinct and weighted with meaning. He speaks now not of specific gods or particular stories, but of what all of this meant, what it continues to mean, how these tales shaped the people who told them and heard them, how they survived in various forms long after the old ways were officially abandoned, how they echo still in language and custom and in the deep structures of how certain people understand the world. His voice has grown even softer, almost a whisper, and you have to strain slightly to hear him, but this effort keeps you tethered to waking just enough to take in these final thoughts. The Norse mythology was never written down as a complete, coherent system by the people who originally believed it. Most of what survived came through two main sources, both recorded centuries after Christianity had become the dominant religion in Scandinavia. The prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson in Iceland around the year 1220, attempted to preserve the old stories and the poetic forms associated with them so that young poets could understand the references and metaphors that pervaded traditional verse. The Poetic Edda, a collection of older poems from various sources, was compiled around the same time, or perhaps slightly earlier. These texts were written by Christians, people who no longer worshipped the old gods, but who valued the cultural heritage and the literary tradition enough to preserve it. This meant that what survived was filtered through a particular lens, that some aspects were likely emphasized while others were downplayed or lost entirely. Before these written sources, the mythology lived entirely in oral tradition, in the memories of poets and storytellers, in the carved images on standing stones, in the way people named their children and their farms, in the oaths they swore and the curses they uttered. When Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the transition was gradual and complex, not a sudden replacement of one belief system with another, but a long period of syncretism and adaptation. People might be baptized Christian, but still leave offerings at sacred groves. They might invoke Christ alongside Thor, hedging their spiritual bets, not entirely certain which divine power might prove more helpful in a given situation. Some elements of the old religion were demonized by Christian missionaries, recast as evil or devilish. Other elements were absorbed or transformed. Nordic saints taking on characteristics of old gods, Christian festivals coinciding with older celebrations and absorbing their customs. The impact of Norse mythology extended far beyond religious practice into the fundamental structures of language and culture. The days of the week in English and other Germanic languages preserve the names of gods. Tuesday from Tyr, Wednesday from Odin, Woden, Thursday from Thor, Friday from either Frigg or Freya. Place names throughout Scandinavia, and areas of Norse settlement incorporated divine names, marking the landscape with layers of sacred meaning that outlasted the religion itself. The legal and social systems that developed in Norse societies bore the imprint of the mythological worldview, the emphasis on honor and reputation, the acceptance of fate combined with the requirement to act courageously nonetheless, the understanding that even the most powerful beings were subject to larger forces and eventual endings. The sagas, the great narrative works of medieval Iceland, were ostensibly Christian in their setting and often in their explicit morality, but they were saturated with the values and worldview of the earlier pagan period. The heroes of the sagas acted according to codes of honor that would have been recognizable to their pagan ancestors, even as they attended church and invoked Christian saints. The concept of weird, of fate, continued to operate in these stories even when officially replaced by Christian providence. People understood themselves as part of a larger pattern, as players in a story whose ending had already been written, but whose telling still mattered, whose performance still required courage and dignity. This mentality, this particular way of facing an uncertain and often brutal world, persisted long after the specific gods were no longer worshipped. In the centuries that followed, Norse mythology went through various phases of reception and interpretation. During the Romantic period of the 18th and 19th centuries, there was renewed interest in Norse myths as expressions of a supposedly pure Germanic or Nordic spirit, a trend that had both scholarly and, unfortunately, nationalistic dimensions. Wagner's operas drew on Norse and Germanic mythology, though freely adapting and combining sources in ways that would have baffled the original storytellers. In the 20th century, scholars like Snorri and later figures developed more rigorous methods for studying the myths as historical and literary artifacts, attempting to understand them within their original contexts rather than simply mining them for nationalist or spiritual purposes. The myths influenced modern fantasy literature profoundly, from Tolkien's Middle-earth, with its dwarves and elves and doom-laden quests, to countless other works that drew on the imagery and themes of Norse cosmology. What persists most strongly, perhaps, is not any specific story, but a mood, an atmosphere, a way of confronting existence that the myths embodied. It's the recognition that power and glory are temporary, that even gods die, that courage consists not in denying death, but in facing it with clear eyes and maintain dignity. It's the understanding that the world is full of forces beyond human control, that nature is simultaneously beautiful and dangerous, that civilization is a fragile construct maintained through constant effort against the chaos that always threatens to return. It's the sense that your actions matter not because they change fate, but because they define who you are, because your reputation, what people say about you after you're gone, is the closest thing to immortality that most people will ever achieve. The gods themselves, in the Norse conception, were not perfect or omnipotent. They were powerful but flawed, capable of petty jealousies and poor decisions, subject to passions and fears. Odin's quest for wisdom led him to sacrifice and suffering, and ultimately couldn't save him from his fated death. Thor's strength protected the worlds, but couldn't overcome every challenge, couldn't prevent Ragnarok. Loki's cleverness helped the gods but also harmed them, and his ultimate betrayal was perhaps inevitable given his nature. This conception of divinity was remarkably human in its recognition of limitation and flaw, of the gap between power and perfection. The gods were beings to respect and honor and seek favor from, but they were not beings to idealize as paragons of virtue. They were, in some sense, as trapped by fate as any human, merely with greater power and longer lifespans before the inevitable ending. You think drowsily about all the stories you've heard tonight, the vast, complicated tapestry of creation and conflict, of wisdom and folly, of courage in the face of certain doom. You think about Yggdrasil, with its roots and branches connecting all the worlds, constantly gnawed at by creatures that would eventually destroy it, but for now still standing, still holding everything together. You think about the Norns carving runes into the tree's trunk, determining fates that could be known but not changed. You think about warriors feasting in Valhalla, preparing for a battle they know they'll lose. You think about Baldur's death and the mistletoe that killed him, about the one small oversight in Frigg's comprehensive protection that allowed tragedy to enter the world of the gods. Outside the Longhouse, the night continues its slow progression toward dawn, though dawn is still many hours away in this deep winter season. The stars wheel overhead, the constellations that the Norse knew by different names and saw different shapes in, patterns that told different stories than those told by people in other lands under the same sky. The sea continues its eternal rhythm against the shore, the sound that has been constant throughout your entire life, that was there before you were born and will continue after you die, indifferent to human concerns, governed by forces that the gods personified, but never fully controlled. Somewhere in the darkness, wolves might be moving through the forest, and you think of Fenrir and Skoll and Hati, those cosmic wolves that even now chase the sun and moon, that will one day catch their prey and end an age. The fire has burned down to coals again, glowing deep red in the darkness, pulsing slightly as drafts move through the hall. The storyteller has fallen silent, or perhaps you simply can no longer hear him, your consciousness having finally slipped across that boundary into actual sleep. Your last waking thought is of the earth rising green from the sea after Ragnarok, of Balder returning, of Leif and Lifthrasir emerging from Yggdrasil to populate a new world. Even in stories of ending, there is continuity, the possibility of renewal, the understanding that life persists even through catastrophe. You carry this thought with you into dreams, into that realm where the boundaries between worlds grow thin, where perhaps you might glimpse something of the great tree yourself, or hear the distant sound of Heimdall's horn, or see the rainbow bridge shimmering against the sky. The old gods may no longer be worshipped, but they endure in memory and story, in the patterns of thought they established, in the questions they asked about courage and fate and meaning, in an uncertain world. And as you sleep, surrounded by your community in this warm, secure space carved out of the northern darkness, the myths continue their work, shaping dreams and waking thoughts alike, connecting you to ancestors who looked at the same stars and wondered at the same mysteries and told these same stories to make sense of their brief passage through existence.